The men in Sinai said, "Do not go up to those ridges in October." They said it plainly, the way mountain people say things they have accepted as fact, long before anyone thought to question them. They said it in the same tone they would use to say, "Do not ford the Ialamita above the second bend after a thaw," or "Do not leave your mules untethered on the eastern slope after dark in August when the wolves are ranging." Not a superstition, a rule. And the way they said it when I told them where I was taking the German clients was not alarm exactly, but a very specific kind of quiet that men use when they have decided there is no point saying more because you are not going to listen anyway. They were right on that last point. I did not listen. My name is Vasile Radu. I am 54 years old. I have been a licensed hunting guide in the Prahova Valley since 1947. I am telling you this account now, in 1978, because you have come from Bucharest to collect these kinds of stories, and because I have decided, after 16 years of not speaking about it, that I would rather have it written down somewhere by someone who is at least trying to be accurate, than have it remain only inside my own head, where it does nothing useful for anyone. I am not asking you to believe me. I am asking you to write down what I tell you. What you do with it after that is your concern. I want to be direct about what kind of man I am, because the kind of man I am is relevant to what I am going to tell you. I am not an imaginative man. I do not tell stories. My wife would tell you I am in fact the least inclined to storytelling of any man she has encountered in her life, and she has not always meant this as a compliment. I have worked in those mountains for 31 years. I know them the way a carpenter knows the grain of wood he has worked his whole career. I have tracked bear, wolf, lynx, chamois, red deer, and wild boar across all 4 seasons, and in conditions ranging from clear autumn days to full blizzards. I have been above the tree line in October storms, with visibility reduced to 10 meters, and navigated back to a valley by memory. I have spent hundreds of nights in camps at elevation, in various parts of the Carpathian range, and I have never in 3 decades of guiding encountered anything that I could not name or account for in ordinary terms. What I encountered in October of 1962, above the Ilomita source in the eastern Bucegi, I cannot account for in ordinary terms. I spent several years trying. I stopped trying approximately 5 years after the fact, because the trying was not producing any result, except that I lost sleep doing it. I am telling you this now not because I have found an explanation, but because I have accepted that there is no explanation I am equipped to find, and I would rather give you the facts while I am still alive, and my memory is intact. The hunt was arranged through a contact in Brasov, who facilitated permits for foreign clients in that period. 2 German clients wanted a licensed chamois hunt in the Carpathian range. They had heard the hunting was strong in the Bucegi, which was accurate. That section of the eastern Bucegi, above the Ialomita source, had seen very little hunting pressure since before the war, and the chamois population had recovered well. Good numbers in the high spruce and in the open meadow terrain above the tree line. Clean shooting ground with manageable access. I had guided similar arrangements for foreign clients 4 or 5 times in the 1950s, and I understood the logistics. I agreed to take the booking. Now I want to tell you about the morning we left Sinai, because there is a detail from that morning that I have replayed more times than I can count, and I want to give it to you accurately. I was loading the supply mules in front of the guest house at approximately 7:30 in the morning. October 9th. The morning was cold and very clear, a hard autumn clarity that makes the ridgelines look closer than they are, and the sky look higher. Good mountain weather. My assistant Mihai was helping me distribute weight across the packs, adjusting the balance for the terrain we would be ascending. We were nearly finished when I heard my name called from the lane. I looked up. It was Gheorghe Aldea, a man I had known for many years. He was a retired forester who had worked the Bucegi range for the better part of 4 decades. Gheorghe was perhaps 70 years old at that point, lean and slow-moving, with a particular way of standing that I had always noticed, slightly sideways to the person he was talking to, as though he had never quite committed to full engagement with a conversation. He crossed the lane and looked at the mules and the packs, and then he looked at me. He asked where I was taking the clients. I told him, Eastern Buchegi, above the Ialomita source, the high camp at roughly 1,800 meters that I had used before. He stood looking at the ridgeline visible above the town for a moment. Then he said, "Not in October, Vasile." I said, "The permit is for October." He said, "I know what the permit says." And then he turned and walked back across the lane and went into the house across the street without saying anything further, and the door closed behind him, and that was the complete extent of the conversation. I stood at the mule with my hand on the pack strap and looked at the closed door for a moment. Mihai was watching me from the other side of the lead animal. I told him to finish the tie-offs, and we loaded the clients and started up the track. I will return to Gheorghe Aldea, but I want to be honest with you about the state of my thinking at the time. I filed what he said in the same category where I kept all the mountain warnings I had collected across 30 years of work in the Carpathians. Every valley, every ridge, every water crossing in this range has some story attached to it, some version of "do not go there," or "do not go there in that season," or "do not go there at night." They accumulate, and most of them are connected to something that happened once, in some particular set of circumstances. That local memory has generalized into a permanent prohibition. I respected Gheorghe. He had more experience in those mountains than almost anyone I knew. But I had hunted in the Buchegi many times without incident, and I had no specific reason to believe that October in that section of the range was more dangerous than October anywhere else. So I let it go, and we went up the mountain. I want to tell you about the clients now. Franz Kellner was 47 years old that October. He was from Stuttgart, a manufacturer of industrial fittings. I mention his occupation not to reduce him to a category, but because the way a man makes his living shapes the way he navigates the world. And Franz navigated the world as a man who moved from specification to output, with minimum deviation from plan. He was large physically, broad through the chest and shoulders, with the kind of physical confidence that develops in men who have been physically capable throughout their lives. He had hunted elk in Sweden and buffalo in Rhodesia, and these experiences existed in his conversation as permanent references, a baseline of what hunting could be and what he could do in it. He was not an unpleasant man. He had a directness that I found professionally workable. He was simply the kind of man who had developed the operating assumption that the world was willing to accommodate his intentions, and this assumption had been confirmed often enough over the years that he no longer examined it. He carried a Haim double rifle of excellent quality that he handled with skill and care. Otto Brandt was Franz's business partner of 20 years and his closest friend. He was 44 years old, quieter, with a quality of observation that I noticed in the first hour of knowing him. Otto watched things. He had a pair of field glasses that he used at all times, not only for hunting but for general observation, the ridge above camp, the tree line, the movement of cloud over the high ground. He asked questions in a way that told me he had already formed an opinion before asking, and was checking his conclusion against mine. He spoke Romanian better than I expected, a careful, formal Romanian with a slight accent, and he used it when he wanted to speak with me privately, which Franz could not follow easily. He kept a small dark blue notebook in his breast pocket that he wrote in frequently. My assistant was Mihai Stoica. He was 22 that October, from a village near Busteni. He had been helping me on hunts for 3 years. He was strong, capable, and quiet in the particular way of young men who are accustomed to physical work and find talking unnecessary for most of it. He spoke no German, and Franz spoke no interest in addressing him in Romanian, so they occupied the same camp with a practical mutual indifference that worked well enough. Mihai did his work, and did it well, and asked questions only when he needed information he did not have. We left Sinaia on the morning of October 9th. The forest track in the lower section was in good condition, the dry, firm ground of a settled autumn after a dry summer, which makes mule work straightforward. We gained elevation through the lower mixed forest, the beech giving way to spruce in the higher section, and reached the high camp clearing by mid-afternoon with 2 hours of light remaining. The clearing was a flat shelf I had used many times before, a natural terrace in the terrain with a reliable spring close by, good drainage, no standing water, and clear sight lines to the north, east, and west, sheltered from the prevailing wind by a spruce stand on the southern side. The muleteer took the animals back down that evening after we unloaded. From that point it was 4 men on foot with supplies for 6 days. I want to tell you about the first evening because there was something that evening I should have paid more attention to, and I want the account to include it. We had set up the 2 tents and started the camp stove, and Mihai was beginning the meal when he came over to me and said, quietly, that the birds had stopped. He said it as a simple observation, not alarmed, just noting it. I registered when he said it that he was correct. Those spruce forests in October have consistent sound at dusk. The jays and nutcrackers are active until the last light fails. Smaller birds settle in with noise. The wind through the upper canopy creates a constant background texture of sound that you stop consciously hearing after a while, the way you stop hearing a clock, but that is always present. That first evening, at the moment when the sound should have been at its peak as the day ended, there was nothing, not gradual quieting, cessation, as though the decision to be silent had been made all at once. I told Mihai it was likely the weather. The barometer I carried had been dropping steadily through the afternoon, and a pressure change can suppress bird activity in the way I was describing. He nodded and went back to the stove. But I stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the northern tree line for a while, the dark line of the spruce about 150 meters from where the tents were pitched, and it was completely still, no movement, no sound. The evening air between the camp and the tree line was clear and very cold, and there was nothing in it. Franz ate well and wrote in his hunting log by the lamp. Otto sat outside after the meal, watching the ridge above the camp through his field glasses until the dark made observation pointless, and then came in and drank tea and did not say much. Nobody spoke more than necessary. The first evening in a new camp always has a quality of adjustment, a period of settling into the place before you are comfortable in it. And I told myself that the silence was simply that. The forest holding its winter quiet earlier than normal because of the pressure and the cold. I did not sleep well that first night. I am noting this because I want the account to be accurate, and this is part of it. I could not identify a specific reason. No sound disturbed me. No movement near the camp. Just a persistent inability to drop into deep rest. A quality of alertness that stayed just below the surface no matter how still I lay. I woke 3 times in the night, and each time the forest outside was absolutely silent, the kind of silence that in ordinary circumstances would be restful, and that night was not. The first 3 days of the hunt were productive, and without incident, in the most important sense. The chamois were present in good numbers. We tracked through the upper spruce in the first morning and found movement in the high meadow terrain above the tree line. Franz shot a fine buck on the second morning at approximately 180 meters, a clean shot that he was quietly proud of, and the quality of his shooting improved his mood for the remainder of the day in a way that made him easier to work with. He became the focused professional version of himself, rather than the managing version, which I preferred. Otto followed the hunt with attention, but seemed as interested in the terrain as in the animals. He spent long periods with his field glasses on the ridge above our camp, and once, on the afternoon of the second day, I caught him writing in his notebook while looking at the tree line on the eastern side of the meadow, rather than at the chamois that Franz was approaching. I noticed, but did not comment. The sounds of those first days were the sounds of working in the mountain forest, the creak of pack straps, the soft percussion of boot on frost-hardened ground. Franz's breathing as we climbed steep sections, controlled but audible. Mihai managing the camp behind us. The metallic small sounds of cookware and equipment. These were ordinary sounds, and they were useful to me because they told me where everyone was. What they could not tell me was why they existed against such complete background silence. The forest should have been audible around us at all times, and it was not. The birds stayed away through all 3 days. The small animals that normally move in the undergrowth and the deadfall were absent. Even the wind, which in October in that terrain normally produces a constant movement in the upper spruce canopy, was almost entirely absent. We worked inside a silence we had brought with us from the valley, and the mountain offered nothing to fill it. I told myself it was the cold settling in early. I told myself these things. The tracks appeared on the morning of the fourth day. Otto had gone out before breakfast, a habit he had established across the first 3 mornings, taking his field glasses to the north edge of the clearing to look at the upper ridge before the others were awake. This was the kind of quiet initiative I respected in a client, the self-sufficiency of a man who did not need to be managed at every moment. He came back to camp at approximately 7 in the morning, with his notebook already open and his expression very controlled in a way I had not seen on him before. He waited until we were alone, while Franz was still in his tent, and then he walked me north of the camp to the ridge path. The prints were in the frost-hardened soil at the side of the path, approximately 200 meters northeast of the tent line. I crouched and looked at them. They were oval in shape, without the claw spread of a bear print, and without the distinct hoof structure of any ungulate that lived in those mountains. The edge of each print was clean and precise, pressed into soil that I tested with my boot heel and found I could barely mark. 4 centimeters deep into ground that resisted my 80-kilogram body weight with a bent knee press. I worked out the force required to make that impression and arrived at something that did not correspond to anything I knew to be walking in the Busegi range. I stood and paced between prints, 1 meter and 90 centimeters, 2 meters, 1 meter 92. The variation was within the range of normal gait variability, which told me these were not isolated impressions but a walking sequence. And the stride length was 2 meters on level ground, in conditions where the terrain offered no reason to lengthen a stride. I looked at the direction of travel. The prints came from the north, from the upper spruce above the ridgeline. They ran south-southeast, parallel to the tree line edge, at a distance of approximately 40 meters from our camp perimeter. The line of travel passed directly along the camp boundary, close enough that anything walking it had an unobstructed view of the clearing where we slept. The prints turned back north before reaching the eastern approach to camp, and disappeared back into the spruce. There was no second trail returning from a different angle. Whatever made the prints had come down from the forest, walked our perimeter, and returned the way it came. Something had assessed our camp in the night. That was the only interpretation I could apply to the pattern of movement I was reading in the frost. I told Otto not to say anything to Franz until I had thought about what to do. He agreed with a short nod that told me he had not needed to think about it as long as I had. We went back to camp and I ate breakfast and watched Franz and said nothing. We went out that 4th morning, and I tracked less chamois than I tracked treeline. I told Franz I was reading the upper ridge for additional animals. He accepted this without suspicion. My attention was in the forest to the north and east, looking for movement, for additional prints, for any sign during daylight of what had been walking our boundary in the dark. I found nothing. The forest in daylight was as still and empty as it had been since our arrival. Not a bird, not a squirrel, not the rustle of a field mouse in the deadfall. The spruce stood in their silence and gave me nothing. That 4th day, Franz wounded a second animal in the afternoon, and we spent nearly 2 hours following it through the upper meadow before he made the second shot. The light was going when we got back to camp. The temperature had dropped sharply in the late afternoon, the hard cold of October in the high Busegi, the kind of cold that comes down from the ridge with a focused intent and changes the quality of the air from autumn to early winter in the space of an hour. I made no fire outside. I set up the lamp inside the tent and kept the outer perimeter dark. I wanted to be able to see the tree line without being framed against a light source. I sat at the entrance to my tent with the flap slightly open toward the north, and I waited for the dark to be complete. It was approximately 7:30 in the evening when the clicking began. It came from the northern tree line, a single position, roughly north-northwest, perhaps 300 meters from where I sat. I want to describe this sound carefully because I have spent 16 years trying to find a comparison for it, and the best I have is this. Imagine the sound a large joint makes under slow, deliberate pressure, the the sound of bone and cartilage moving through their range in a controlled extension, multiplied by a factor of perhaps 10 in scale. Not a crack, not a fracture, not the sharp pop of something breaking. A slow, weighted, rhythmic release of pressure from something dense. Click, 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 pause, click, click, measured intervals. The tempo of something counting, rather than something in distress. It lasted 11 minutes. I checked my watch when it started, and checked it again when it stopped. The sound did not move. The source remained fixed in the tree line through all 11 minutes. Then it stopped, completely and immediately, and the forest returned to its total silence. Mihai had come back from the spring and was standing at the tent line when I turned around. He stood with both hands at his sides, looking at the northern tree line. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The sound he had just heard was the same sound I had just heard, and it required no translation between us. Franz had come out of his tent with his rifle at the beginning of the sound. He had done this instinctively, hearing an unfamiliar sound in darkness, and reaching for the tool designed for unfamiliar sounds in darkness. He asked me what it was. I told him I did not know. He asked if I had heard it before. I told him I had not. He considered this and then offered several explanations. A woodpecker working a hollow trunk, some acoustic effect of cold air, amplifying a distant sound, wood contracting in the deep cold. A type of stag vocalization he was not familiar with from his European hunting experience. These were not stupid suggestions. They were the suggestions of a man trained to apply known categories to new data, which is the correct first response. The problem was that none of the categories fit. I said that woodpeckers do not work hollow trunks at night, and that the sound had not moved for 11 minutes, which argued against anything in flight or in motion. He thought about this and said it was almost certainly a natural sound of some kind, and that he was going back to write his log. He went inside. Otto had not said anything throughout this exchange. He had sat outside his tent the whole time, with his field glasses hanging unused around his neck, listening in the direction of the sound, and when it stopped, he lit a cigarette and sat for a while longer. I went to bed with my boots on. The sound did not return that night, but the silence it left behind occupied the forest differently than ordinary silence occupies a space, and I lay in the tent for 3 hours listening to it, before I finally slept toward dawn. On the morning of the 5th day, I showed Franz the tracks. I walked him up the ridge path and showed him the prints in the frost-hardened soil, and I let him look at them without speaking first. He crouched and examined them with the same care he applied to everything physical, pressing his finger into the soil beside each print, comparing the depth with the result of his own boot heel pressed hard. He stood and paced the stride length, one print to the next. He stood for a while looking north up the ridge path toward the forest. He said the cold could distort prints. He said frost heave could change the apparent spacing between tracks. He said a large bear with an unusual gait might produce something approaching what he was looking at. I said that a bear does not stride 2 meters on level terrain without exception. He said an exceptional animal might. I said that the press depth was 4 centimeters into soil that resisted my body weight, applied through a boot heel. No bear distributes its weight in a pattern that would produce this depth at that edge definition. He looked at me. He said, "What are you proposing, Vasile?" I said, I was not yet proposing anything. I was showing him what I had found and giving him my professional assessment of what it was not. He looked at the tree line for a moment. He said the tracks were unexplained, but that unexplained tracks were not an uncommon feature of wilderness, and that they did not constitute a reason to end a permitted hunt. He had, he reminded me, encountered unexplained signs in wilderness hunting on 3 continents, and had not ended a hunt on any of those occasions. He said we would continue. I looked at Otto. Otto was writing in his notebook, looking at the tracks, and did not meet my eyes. I had not yet told Franz about the sound. I was building the case in stages, which I thought was the correct strategy. I wanted each piece of information to land separately and have weight independently before I connected them. In retrospect, I think the strategy did not account for the fact that Franz's response to each individual piece of evidence was to file it under the category of explicable natural phenomenon and move on. I was building a case for a man who was not in a courtroom. The fifth day, I began preparing for early departure without announcing it. I told Mihai, in Romanian, while Franz was eating, to begin consolidating the heavy supplies, non-essential equipment, the items we would not need for sleeping and cooking that night. I wanted them packed and weight distributed for fast movement. I told him I was watching the weather, but that I wanted us to be able to move quickly if conditions changed. He looked at me with the directness of a 22-year-old who understands he is not being given the complete reason for an instruction. He packed without comment. I also decided to move the camp. I told Franz it was for weather reasons, that I wanted to move to a lower and more sheltered position on the saddle I knew about a kilometer to the south, which would give us better protection if the pressure dropped further. This was not false information. The position I had in mind was genuinely better sheltered. It was also lower and closer to the track down to the valley, and it had better sight lines on the northern approach, which was not something I mentioned to Franz. He accepted the move without strong objection, because it did not significantly limit his access to the hunting ground, and because the barometric reading gave the weather explanation some credibility. We spent the fifth afternoon relocating the camp and setting it up on the new ground. The new camp was in a natural saddle in the spruce, lower and more enclosed than the exposed high camp, with the trees pressing in from the north and east, and the open meadow ground to the south and west. It had the quality of a position with defensible approaches. I was not thinking about defense in any military sense. I was thinking about having fewer directions from which something could approach us unseen. The birds were still silent. That fifth evening, while Franz was checking his equipment and Mihai was making the meal, Otto came to find me at the spring. He was carrying his notebook open to a page near the back. He showed me entries he had made across the 5 days of the hunt, a methodical record of the absence of bird sound, cross-referenced with temperature readings, barometric pressure values, and time of day. He had recorded the precise times when bird activity should have been present, based on the season and the habitat type, and had noted the complete absence of any sound at each of those times. He had done this every day since the first evening, quietly and without mentioning it, and had been building a database of what was not there. He pointed to a line at the bottom of the page. He had written, "Pattern is not seasonal weather suppression, not a storm response, not a predator passage event. Continuous absence across full daylight and evening periods. Indicates sustained displacement of all normal prey species activity across the full observable range of this habitat. Duration, 5 days." I read this twice. He said, "I did not want to say this to Franz until I was certain of the pattern." I asked him if he was certain. He said, "I am certain of the data. The interpretation is yours." I said we would discuss it in the morning. He nodded and closed the notebook. That fifth night, the clicking came from 3 directions. I want to be very careful about this because the difference between the 4th night and the 5th night is the most important detail in the entire account, and I want you to understand exactly what it was. On the 4th night, the clicking had come from one position, north-northwest, fixed, 11 minutes, single source. On the 5th night, at the new camp, it began the same way, from the north, the same measured sequence I had heard the previous evening. Single source, same tempo. But within 5 minutes of the first sound beginning, a second source started to the east, not a reflection or a resonance, a separate sequence with its own rhythm, slightly offset from the first, coming from the eastern tree line, approximately 200 meters from our new camp perimeter. And within another 3 or 4 minutes, a third source began from the northwest. 3 positions, 3 separate rhythmic sequences, each slightly out of phase with the other 2, none of them synchronizing, none of them responding directly to the others. When you lay in the tent with your eyes open in the dark and listened, what you heard was a layered sound, 3 overlapping patterns from 3 different directions, like 3 clocks in 3 rooms, each running at a slightly different speed. The sound had a texture of deliberateness to it that is difficult to convey. It was not chaotic. It was not a confusion of animals calling in the night. It was organized, in the way that a coordinated thing is organized, and the organization was around us. I lay in my tent, and I timed the sequences with my watch. I recorded the pauses. Each source paused at intervals of approximately 40 seconds. Each source maintained its own tempo consistently across the 2-hour duration. I counted the positions against the orientation of the tent and estimated compass bearings as well as I could from inside the canvas. North-northwest, east-northeast, and northwest. 3 points roughly equidistant from the camp center, roughly equally spaced around the perimeter. The sound ran for approximately 2 hours and then stopped. All 3 sources stopped within seconds of each other, not one by one, together, in the same moment. The forest went back to its complete silence. I heard Mihai's breathing through the tent canvas. Careful, slow, the breathing of someone listening very hard. He had been awake the entire time. I did not speak to him. In the morning, Otto was at the spring with his notebook, before I had finished dressing. He had done what I had done. He had recorded the compass bearings of each sound source, the start and stop times, and the estimated distance. He had drawn a diagram, 3 points arranged around a circle, the camp at the center, each point marked with its bearing and an estimated distance. He had drawn connecting lines between the 3 points. The result was a rough equilateral triangle with the camp at its geometric center. He said, "Vasile, I think it was surrounding us." I said yes. That was what the data said. He said, "And it followed us when we moved the camp." This was the element I had been sitting with since waking. The previous night's sound had come from the north of the high camp. That night's sound had come from 3 positions around the new camp, a kilometer to the south. Whatever was making the sound had not stayed at the high camp. It had located us at the new camp, assessed the perimeter, and placed itself at 3 positions equidistant from the camp center. The relocation of our camp had been incorporated into its behavior, not disrupted it. I said to Otto, "We need to leave this morning." He said, "I agree." I told him to keep Franz occupied while I made final preparations with Mihai, that I wanted everything staged before I had the conversation with Franz, because the conversation was going to be difficult, and I wanted it to happen with the bags ready. The conversation happened before the bags were ready. Franz found Mihai consolidating the heavy stores and asked what was happening. Mihai explained in Romanian, without the context. Franz came directly to me. I told him everything then, in sequence, beginning with the tracks on the 4th morning and ending with what Otto and I had both recorded the previous night, 3 positions, 2 hours, all 3 stopping simultaneously. I gave him the compass bearings. I described the sound. I explained the relocation of source positions from the high camp to the new camp. I gave him the full account without omission. Franz listened to all of it. He stood with his arms crossed and listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are describing sounds from a mountain forest at night." I said, "I was describing 3 organized sound sources that had surrounded our camp simultaneously, from fixed and equally spaced positions for 2 hours, and had stopped at the same instant." He said, "Animals communicate. Wolves chorus. Many nocturnal animals call at night in patterns." I said I was familiar with wolves, and that this was not wolves, and that the positioning and timing were not consistent with any pack behavior I had studied. He said, "What is it then?" I said I did not know. I said that was the reason I was recommending we leave. He said, "We have 1 day remaining on this permit. I have paid a significant sum, and I have come a very long distance, and I have 1 day left, and I intend to use it. You are a guide, Vasile. Guiding is your function. The decision about whether the hunt continues is not within your function." I said that safety was within my function, and that this situation fell within my responsibility as guide. He said there was no demonstrated threat. There were sounds, and there were footprints. Neither of those was a demonstrated threat. Otto said, quietly, Franz. Franz turned to him. Otto said, "I think we should listen to Radu." There was a silence. Franz looked at Otto with an expression that I recognized from the dynamics I had observed between them across 5 days. He said, "I did not ask what you think." Otto looked at his notebook. He did not respond. He closed the notebook and put it in his pocket. I looked at Franz and I said, "I will remain through today. We will not hunt tomorrow. We leave at first light tomorrow morning, regardless of what remains on the permit." He held the look for a moment, and then he said he intended to use the remaining time productively, since we were apparently leaving early. He picked up his rifle. He went out. I told Mihai to have everything packed and ready to move by nightfall, not just consolidated, packed and staged at the edge of the clearing for fast loading. The 6th day has a particular quality in my memory that is hard to separate from what happened at the end of it. I know intellectually that the 6th day was largely unremarkable, that we went out in the morning and tracked without finding good animals, that Franz shot at a chamois in the afternoon and missed cleanly and did not say much about it, that we returned to camp in the failing light. But the day felt, even at the time, like a day that was waiting for something. The quality of waiting that you feel in a room before a meeting you already know is going to go badly. The meadows above our new camp were empty. The chamois we had seen moving there on previous days were gone. Franz attributed this to the wind changing, but there was no wind. The animals had simply moved away, all of them, from this section of ground, in the way that prey animals move away from a territory when something they fear has taken up residence in it. I did not say this to Franz. I want to tell you what I did during that 6th day, in the intervals when I was not tracking with Franz. I walked the perimeter of the new camp twice, carefully, looking for evidence of approach or presence near the camp boundary. I found no prints near the new camp. The frost around the tent lines was unmarked. Whatever had been making the sound the previous night had done so from the tree line and not come closer, and it had left no physical evidence of its exact position. I examined the tree line on the eastern and northern sides of the saddle, looking for disturbed vegetation, compressed ground, any sign of where something had stood for 2 hours in the dark. I found nothing I could point to as definitive. The forest kept its evidence. I also walked the track south, toward the valley, the first 400 meters of it, checking the surface for anything I needed to know about the condition at night. It was in reasonable shape, steep in the upper section through the spruce but well defined. I noted 3 points where the terrain was tricky in poor light, a section where the track narrowed between rock outcrops, a bend where the eastern forest came close, a steep descent on loose frost-covered shale just before the lower meadow opened. I fixed these in my mind. We came back to camp as the light went. The temperature dropped fast, faster than the previous evenings. A deep cold that came off the high ridge and settled over the saddle like something taking ownership of the place. I organized the camp without making a fire outside. I had everyone eat quickly and I wanted tents before full dark. I told Mihai specifically, in Romanian, standing close to him while Franz was out of earshot. If I come to you tonight and say we are going, you have 30 seconds to be on your feet and moving. He looked at me. He said he understood. I told him one more thing. I said, "Do not take anything that is not already in your hand." He nodded. I got into my tent with my jacket on and my boots on and my pack at arm's reach, and the tent flap opened 3 centimeters toward the north. I lay on my back and I waited. It was approximately 8:30 in the evening when the clicking began. Not from the tree line, from the slope above the camp. The open slope to the south of our position. Behind us, the direction we had assumed was clear. The open meadow slope that rose steeply above the saddle toward the high ridge, frost grass and exposed rock with no tree cover, ground we could see in daylight and had assessed as an open approach with no concealment. We had organized the camp with the tents facing north, our best watch on the direction with forest cover. The slope behind us had seemed self-evidently safe because anything on it would have been visible from our camp in daylight. What was on that slope at 8:30 on the 6th evening was not visible. It was dark, and the slope rose steeply above us into a darkness that the stars did not penetrate, and the clicking came from approximately 80 meters up that slope, from the open ground directly above and behind our camp. It was much closer than any of the previous nights. Not 300 meters, not 200 meters, 80 meters. Close enough that I could hear the individual character of each click in the sequence, the texture of it, the specific quality of mass and density that I had been trying to name since the first night. Close enough that it filled the space inside the tent, the way a sound fills a room, rather than the way a sound carries across a valley. I came out of my tent. Mihai was outside his tent already. He was standing with his small axe in both hands, not raised, held at his sides. He was looking up the slope. He did not look at me when I came out. He kept his eyes on the slope. I did not need to wake the others. I heard the rustle of Otto's tent and he came out. I heard Franz's tent, and he came out with his rifle. I spoke once, low and level. I said, "We are going now. Take your rifle. Take your warmest layer. Take nothing else. We go now." Franz opened his mouth. I said, "Look at where the sound is coming from." He looked up the slope. The clicking was steady above us, measured, 80 meters up the open frost-covered ground behind the camp. There was nothing to see, just the slope, black against the slightly lighter black of the sky, and the sound coming from somewhere on that slope in the dark. He looked at me. I said, "We go now." We went. I took the lamp at low setting. We moved out of the camp and onto the south track in a group, close together, moving at a fast walk. I had told them not to run yet, and I meant it, because the upper section of the track through the spruce was steep and narrow, and running it in the dark was how you fell and broke an ankle, and a broken ankle on that track that night was not something I was willing to think about. Fast walk, controlled pace. Eyes forward, I was in front, and I kept the lamp low so we could see the track surface, and not be seen against a bright light from above. The clicking stopped when we left the camp. I counted seconds as I walked. I reached 60. The forest was silent. I reached 90. Still silent. I thought for 30 seconds, and I mean this was a complete thought, not a hope, an actual assessment, that perhaps the act of departure was the thing it wanted, that removing ourselves from its territory was the transaction that would end the encounter. Then the clicking began again, from the eastern forest alongside the track. Not from the slope behind us, from inside the spruce, 40 meters to the east of the track, parallel to our direction of travel, moving at our pace, keeping exact distance. I said to the others, low and level, faster. We increased the pace. The clicking increased with us. The distance did not change. Whatever was in the eastern forest was matching our speed with no apparent effort. No increase in the rhythm of the clicking, no sound of movement through undergrowth. Just the clicking at 40 meters moving south alongside us, at whatever speed we moved. Otto spoke directly behind me. He said, "It is keeping pace." I said yes. The track descended through a dense section of spruce, where the canopy closed overhead and the lamplight was confined to a tight circle around us. The eastern forest was invisible beyond the first 3 or 4 meters of trees. The clicking came out of that darkness at a steady distance, consistent and unhurried. Ahead of me, I was tracking the path surface by memory as much as by the lamp, watching for the features I had noted that afternoon, the narrow section between the rock outcrops, the bend where the forest edge came close, the shale section below. The bend came. I saw it in the lamplight as we approached it, the track curving west, the eastern forest edge moving toward us as the curve brought the path closer to the trees. I had 40 meters of track before the apex of the bend. I shortened my stride and stayed on the track and did not slow down more than necessary. I could feel the others tightening up behind me, closing the distance between us. At the apex of the bend, the eastern forest was 20 meters from the track edge. The clicking was at the forest edge. I looked to my right. I want to tell you precisely what I saw because precision is what I can give you and what I owe you in this account. The lamplight reached 8 or 10 meters into the trees at that point. What I saw was at the far edge of that light, a shape between two spruce trees. Primarily vertical, primarily upright, very large. I say primarily because the shape was not perfectly still, and I caught it in what appeared to be a shift of weight between its stance and a slight lean toward the track. It occupied the space between two trees that I estimate stood 4 meters apart. The width of the shape relative to that gap suggested something of considerable breadth. I saw 2 reflections of the lamplight at a height well above 2 meters from the ground. Not the eyes of something low and quadrupedal, something looking down at us from height, from a position of elevation over a standing man. The clicking stopped at the instant I looked at it. That instant of silence and that shape in the lamplight is the thing I have come back to most often in 16 years. Not the sound of it, though I hear the sound. Not the tracks, though I have measured them in my memory 100 times. That moment of it going silent when I looked at it. That implies something I do not want to name in these terms, because I am trying to give you a factual account and not a philosophical one, but it implies an awareness of observation, an awareness that it was being looked at, and a response to that awareness. I do not know what to do with that implication, except to give it to you and let you decide. I ran. I am not going to dress this up. I ran down that track as fast as I could manage safely in the dark with a lamp in one hand, and I heard the others running behind me, their boots on the frozen track. Mihai close behind me, his breathing fast and steady, and behind him the sound of Otto and Franz running, and no clicking from the eastern forest, only the sound of us on the track and the cold air and my own heartbeat. I ran for what I judged to have been 60 to 70 seconds. The track opened onto the lower meadow section, flat ground with extended sight lines, and the lights of the first farm in the valley visible in the distance below, and I stopped. I turned around. Mihai stopped 2 steps behind me. He was breathing hard, both hands on his knees. The track going back into the spruce above us was dark beyond the reach of the lamp. Otto was not on the track. Franz was not on the track. I called Otto's name up the track. I called it twice, at intervals. Nothing came back. I called Franz's name. Nothing came back from the dark above us, except the cold air moving down from the mountain. Mihai straightened up. He put his hand on my arm. Not hard, not pulling me, just present. I called the names again, once each. Silence. I stood at the edge of the lower meadow with the lamp and looked at the track into the spruce above me for a long time. There was nothing moving on it, no sound from inside the forest. The clicking had stopped when I looked at the shape. It had not resumed. The forest was as silent as it had been every night since we arrived, the deep, complete silence of a place that has expelled everything that normally lives in it and made room for something else. Mihai said my name quietly. I stood there for another long moment, and then I turned away from the mountain, and we walked to the valley road. I want to be very clear about the decision I made in that moment. It is the decision I have examined most in the years since, and I have never reached a satisfactory conclusion about it. I know that Mihai would not have let me go back up the track. I know that he was right not to let me. I know that 2 men on that dark track, against whatever was in that forest, would have produced one of 2 outcomes, both of them the same. I know all of this. It does not resolve anything. I left 2 men on that mountain, and I walked to the valley with their assistant, and that is what I did. We reached the valley road at approximately midnight. We walked to the nearest farmhouse. I woke the family and explained in Romanian what had happened, omitting most of the relevant facts, and saying only that 2 clients had become separated on the track in darkness, and I needed someone to take us to Sinaia. The husband drove us in his cart before dawn, without asking many questions. I filed a report with the district office at first light on October 15th. The search party assembled that morning, and went up the following day. I went with them. I did not want to go, but I knew the terrain, and they asked me to lead them, and I went. We found the new camp on the saddle. Both tents were standing. The organized packs Mihai had prepared were at the clearing edge, exactly as he had left them. Franz's luggage was there. Otto's second bag was there. The cookware, the stores. The camp looked like a place where people had stepped away and had not returned to collect what they left. On the track below the camp, in the upper section through the dense spruce, the search party found our 4 sets of boot prints moving south. They followed them. They found the rocky section, the section where the track narrows between outcrops, the bend. At the bend, where the eastern forest had been 20 meters from the track edge, the search party found disturbance in the ground and undergrowth at the forest edge that they could not attribute to any specific cause. Then the track continued south with 2 sets of boot prints on it, mine and Mihai's, and 2 sets of boot prints turned east from the track at a point just beyond the bend. The search party followed the 2 eastern sets of prints into the spruce. The prints were clear in the frost for approximately 80 meters inside the forest, moving east and slightly north, and then they ended in a small flat area between 4 large spruce trees, where the ground was compressed moss and low frost cover that registered prints poorly. The 2 sets of boot prints simply stopped. No drag marks, no sign of a struggle or fall, no buttons, no torn fabric, no equipment dropped. 2 men walked into those trees and did not walk out. The search party worked the forest in that section for 2 full days. They extended the search radius. They checked the creek in the valley below for any sign of a fall from the steep ground east of the track. They found nothing. On the 3rd day of searching, a member of the party went up to the original high camp to see whether the clients had possibly circled back there during the night. He found the high camp undisturbed as well. And on the open slope above the high camp, on the frost-covered meadow ground well above the spruce band, on a section of slope that was approximately 400 meters above our saddle camp, and that no member of our hunting party had walked at any point during the 6 days, he found Franz Kellner's leather field pouch. It was lying on its side in the frost-hardened grass. It was closed and latched. He brought it down, and I opened it. Inside were Franz Kellner's chamois permit, his hunting log, and a small photograph of a woman and 2 young adults that I assumed were his family. The documents were dry and in good condition. They had not been exposed to weather. The permit was dated October 9 to October 14, 1962. The hunting log contained entries for the first 5 days and stopped on the afternoon of the 5th day, the last entry describing the chamois Franz had missed and expressing the intention to do better on the final day. Franz Kellner never wrote the final entry. The district office investigation ran for several weeks. I gave my account to the inquiry, a version of what I am telling you now, though I omitted the interpretive elements and confined myself to what I had directly observed. The inquiry concluded that the 2 clients had become disoriented in dark conditions while attempting to descend the track, had left the established path at the bend where the terrain was confusing in poor visibility, and had fallen from a section of steep ground east of the track. The creek system in the valley below was searched. Nothing was recovered. The official district record states, probable accident in conditions of low visibility, 2 subjects, German nationals, Franz Kellner and Otto Brandt, missing, presumed deceased. I kept the pouch. After the inquiry closed, I asked the district office if anyone had claimed it, and they said the families had been notified but had not sent anyone to collect the effects. I said I would take it. They let me take it. The pouch is in my desk drawer. The permit is inside it. October 9 to October 14. He never used the 6th day. I have not returned to the eastern Bucegi ridges above the Ealomita source. I work lower ground now, valley paths and lower forest slopes, the kind of terrain that tourists walk in summer and that I can guide in any season without concern. When foreign clients ask about the high chamois ground in the Bucegi range, I tell them the population has shifted and the ground is not currently productive. This is not true. The chamois are still there. The ground is as productive as it has ever been for a licensed hunt. I have seen it from below in every October since 1962, and I know the animals are there. I will not take anyone up there. You have asked me what I think it was. I understand why you ask. You have traveled from Bucharest specifically to hear accounts of this kind, and you need the account to conclude with something you can file in a category and compare against other accounts. The old people in the villages along the Ialomita Valley have categories. I have heard the names they use. Gheorghe Aldea would have been able to tell you exactly what category this belonged to, and exactly what the rules of encounter with it were. And perhaps if I had gone back to him in the winter, after the events, he could have told me why October specifically, why those ridges specifically. Gheorghe died in February 1964, and I never spoke to him again after the morning we left Sinaia. I do not use the names the village people use. I am not equipped to evaluate them. What I can tell you is what I directly observed over 6 days on those ridges in October 1962. Something was present in that forest from the first night, something that registered our arrival and spent the first 3 days in silence, in total absence of any sign, while we established ourselves. Something that walked our camp perimeter on the 4th night at a stride length of 2 meters, pressing 4 centimeters into frozen soil, and returned to the forest without entering the camp. Something that made a sound on the 4th evening that I cannot match to any animal I know, from a single fixed position for 11 minutes, and then stopped. Something that came to 3 positions around our new camp on the 5th night, spent 2 hours there, and stopped all 3 sources simultaneously. Something that came off the open slope above the camp on the 6th night, from a direction we had not protected, at a distance close enough that I could hear the individual weight of each click from inside my tent. Something that followed us down the track at our exact pace for an unknown distance, and stopped when I looked at it. Something that was still in that forest when the search party went up the following day and found nothing. I sleep poorly. This has been consistently true since October 1962, and it is worse in October. When the nights come early and the temperature drops in the way it dropped on those ridges, and the birds go quiet in the evening in the way they went quiet from the first night in that camp, I lie in my bed in this valley and I hear it. Not every night, not most nights, but on certain nights, when the conditions align in the particular way they aligned up there, I hear the clicking from outside the window, from the direction of the lower forest, where the trees begin, at the edge of the village fields. A slow, rhythmic sequence, measured and deliberate, the tempo of something that is in no hurry. I do not go to the window. I do not go to the window because I am afraid of what I might see looking back. And I am not a man who admits fear easily, and I am admitting it to you now only because giving you an accurate account requires it. The pouch sits in my desk drawer. I have thought about sending it to the Kellner family in Stuttgart. I have started that letter 3 times. Each time I stop because I cannot find a way to explain how his hunting permit and his log and his photograph of his family came to be lying sealed and undamaged on a slope 400 meters above a camp he never walked to, in a place that nothing about our 6 days on that mountain explains. I cannot put that in a letter. I cannot put it in terms that help the people who received it. So the pouch stays in my drawer and the letter does not get sent. I am telling you this account because I want a correct description to exist somewhere outside my own head. Not the district file with its probable accident in conditions of low visibility. A description of what actually happened, from the man who was there, who is not a superstitious man, and not a storytelling man, and not a man with any reason to invent or exaggerate. What I have told you is what happened. The extent of it is what I have told you, no more and no less. Something was in those ridges in October 1962. It knew we were there. It watched us, and then it came for us. And the way it came for us, patient and organized and from the direction we had not protected, tells me that whatever it was not acting without intention. Whether that constitutes intelligence in the sense you would apply to a human decision, I am not equipped to say. But it was not random. It was not blind. I was the hunting guide. Bringing people safely through those mountains was my profession and my obligation. I brought myself and my young assistant to the valley road. I left 2 men on a dark track in the upper spruce above the Ialomita source on the night of October 14, 1962, and I have not spoken of it until this afternoon because there is no version of that account that sits comfortably in daylight. But you have come from Bucharest to write it down, and I am still alive, and my memory is intact. Do not go above the Alamita source in October, not in those ridges, Not after dark. Not for any permit. And not for any price. That is all I can tell you.